All right. Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody. We're back with our weekly and/or semi-weekly chat with author Kevin McAleer on a variety of literature. Focused so far exclusively on American authors. And the last few sessions, we've been going with LA authors specifically, um, such as Raymond Chandler, James M. Cain, Charles Bukowski, John Fonte, and now we're going to explore one of the great works of Nathanael West, of the well-known Day of the Locust. I have no idea what Kevin thinks of Nathanael West or Day of the Locust. He probably has no idea what I think of him either. So we're just coming into this cold. That's how we do all our sessions. We don't really prepare them, and we never know what the other is going to say. Sometimes we agree on things, sometimes we disagree, but we can agree to disagree in many respects if we want. Now, Kevin, I'm going to ask, I have no idea what you've read of Nathanael West, and if you read it this time around or you read it before. Tell me your experience with Day of the Locust, please.
I have read it. I read it many years back for the first time. And the first time I read it, I wasn't impressed. And I came back to it a few years later because everyone raved about it. And I was thinking, I just don't get it. Am I stupid? Sometimes I am. I think I've said before that I give books a second chance that people really tout, but I'm also giving myself a second chance to not only enjoy something, but to be able to zone in on what I might have missed by virtue of my development over the years. You read books differently as you get older. And I think this is about the third time I've read it.
You just read it fourth. You read it this week again?
I read it this week again, yeah. I read it, this could be the third or fourth time. So that as preface, I've also read Miss Lonely Hearts of Nathanael West. Just briefly on West, just to get that out of the way. He was born Nathan Weinstein, or Weinstein, Steen or Stein, who knows? I've heard it pronounced both ways. He changed his name at some point. I think a lot of Jews did that in order to, they thought at least, to be able to better assimilate into American society. I don't know why he changed it. Maybe that was the reason. He wrote 4 novels or novellas. They're very short, all of his 4 works. I'll just enumerate them briefly. The Dream Life of Balzo Snell, 1931. Miss Lonely Hearts, 1933. A Cool Million, 1934. And The Day of the Locust, 1939. He was born in 1903. He died in 1940 in a car accident with his newlywed. Very sad. And he spent most of his time in Los Angeles. He was born in New York originally. He spent most of his time in Los Angeles as a screenplay writer. So he had sort of the reverse biography of John Fonte. He came to Los Angeles as a screenplay writer and sort of, well, didn't become a novelist. I think he published 1 or 2 things before he came to LA. But he had already, then he established himself, at least as a, as one could argue, a great author with The Day of the Locust, whereas with Fonte, he sort of established himself with his great work in 1939, the very year, Ask the Dust. And from there on, he went to become a screenplay writer. So that's how West earned a lot of his money. He came from a rather moneyed family, it seems, though, anyway. So it wasn't as if he was struggling like Fonte, like we read in Ask the Dust. So those are sort of the parameters of his life. So I came to this novel. This is, I think, his longest one. It's 165 pages in my version of it. with a foreword by Bud Schulberg, by the way, who will be reading maybe next week. What makes Sammy run?
Mine has a foreword by Alfred Kazin.
Ah, okay.
So you get the movie people doing some intros here.
Yeah, why not? And the book, let's just talk about the plot briefly, and then we'll get into our respective judgments of it. It's very simply told. It's a young man. His name is Todd Hackett, T-O-D, which is interesting for me because Todd, pronounced Tod, is death in German. And a fellow by the name of Nathan Weinstein, Nathan Weinstein or Steen, growing up in New York, would certainly be familiar with the German Tod, if only by dint of the Yiddish that I'm sure he had some grasp of familiarity with. So that, I'm certain, is not accidental. And I haven't read anyone mentioning that, so that's why I mentioned it right off the top. And it's not without relevance to this book, I should think, because the cast of thousands, to keep with the movie metaphor, in this book are the minions who have come to California, Los Angeles in this case, with dreams of sunshine and pleasurable, hedonistic life, and they are all disappointed. Their dreams come to nothing. And what West writes very early on about this Todd Hackett, he's from the Yale School of Fine Arts, and he has come to, he's hired by some studio to paint and decorate sets. But he's also doing his own private work in the meantime. And he's got this one big tableau plan called The Burning of Los Angeles. And the faces that populate this vast tableau that he's working on are of the people he sees on the streets. And West writes about them. Excuse me, he talks about all the people and the funny clothes they're wearing on Vine Street. Scattered among those masquerades were people of a different type. Their clothing was somber and badly cut, bought from mail-order houses. While the others moved rapidly, darting into stores and cocktail bars, they loitered on, they loitered on the corners or stood with their backs to the shop windows and stared at everyone who passed. When their stare was returned, their eyes filled with hatred. At this time, Todd knew very little about them except that they had come to California to die. They were the people he felt he must paint. So this cast of thousands of disappointed, disillusioned, disenchanted thousands out there, they are not incidental to the novel. In fact, they carry the thesis of his novel that the American dream incarnate can be seen in those who come to sun-kissed California and are sorely disappointed. So the book is basically a criticism of the California dream, which is the American dream writ large. I talked about this earlier, how we all talk about how America was the place of reinvention for all the huddled masses who came to America in the 19th and early 20th century in particular. It's actually the home of your invention. It's the home where they invented themselves. And I argued that California is then where they reinvent themselves, right? That's where you reinvent. We always use the term reinvention, but that's where it happens in California. So West is really onto something here, I think. You know, these Americans, often from almost all of them except Native American Indians, are of immigrant stock at some point, and they have come to America to invent themselves, invent a new life from scratch, start again afresh, and then they go to California to reinvent themselves. That's how it basically happened. Most of the people who went to California during the gold rush, after the Americans stole California from the Mexicans in the Mexican-American War, basically, I would argue, they reinvent themselves, right? So it's a two-step process, and West is talking about how this reinvention process is, for most of these people, a failure. They're not happy. Good. So that off the top. A quick rundown of the other characters. There's Homer Simpson. We've heard this name before, right? It first occurs, at least in literature, it seems, in this book by West. He's a hotel bookkeeper who seems to have had some kind of nervous breakdown, from Iowa, and he comes to California on a doctor's recommendation to recuperate in the sun. This is also what I would argue is a prerequisite, at least of those from mid-century, from the mid-20th century, of those great LA novels. At least The Day of the Locust fulfills the first prerequisite of being a great LA novel, in that everyone in the cast of characters comes from somewhere else. So he's good there, right? He's good there. Then you have Faye Greener, who is sort of the female centerpiece of the whole novel. She's this 17 or 18-year-old beauty who wants to become an actress. And she's the object of everyone's desire. Todd, Homer, a couple other guys, namely Earl Shoup, who's a movie cowboy. He's also got the hots for Faye. Miguel, who's a Mexican cockfighter. He raises cocks to fight. And we have a very graphic description of a cockfight on the part of West. It's very interesting, I find. He must have witnessed a few of these. And there's the father of Faye Greener, Harry Greener, who's a washed-up vaudevillian from back east. And now all he does is he sells this homemade silver polish that is basically a chance for him, when he goes door to door, to do his clownish shtick from vaudeville. He's really kooky. There's this Abe Kusich fellow. He's a dwarf who works as a bookie and otherwise as a opportunistic hustler. There's Mrs. Jennings, who is a high-class madam of a Hollywood brothel. There's Claude Este, who is a friend of Todd's from the studio. He's a successful screenwriter, and he lives in this big antebellum manse, and he styles himself sort of a Kentucky colonel. So this also is indicative of how Day of the Locust fulfills another prerequisite of what I would argue is a great LA novel through the influence of Hollywood. Everyone's playing a role. Everyone's playing a part. And Faye, maybe I didn't mention it, she wants to really make her life playing roles and parts as an actress. And it has to be said, she's probably not that good. We don't know. She's young enough. She can improve. She's basically just a sexy young thing who gives the come on to everyone she meets in the hope that there'll be some big producer or director get discovered. And I think that Nathanael West's attentions, or at least his best writing, is focused on Faye. There's some great descriptions of her. He really captures her. And in the through the eyes of Todd, it has to be said, although this is written in the third person. Todd sees Faye. She lay stretched out on the divan with her arms and legs spread as though welcoming a lover, and her lips were parted in a heavy, sullen smile. She was supposed to look inviting, but the invitation wasn't to pleasure, but to struggle, hard and sharp, closer to murder than to love. If you threw yourself on her, it would be like throwing yourself from the parapet of a skyscraper. You would do it with a scream. You couldn't expect to rise again. Your teeth would be driven into your skull like nails into a pine board, and your back would be broken. You wouldn't even have time to sweat or close your eyes. His best descriptions are where he's focusing on this, this young lady, Faye Greener. And I can give you more. Maybe I'll give you a couple more as the book goes on. But that's indicative of his writing. The book doesn't go anywhere, really. It kind of goes in circles, sort of episodic. Reminded me a lot of Kafka, whom I don't like. I know that's very uncool. It's very unintellectual. I don't like Kafka. He's gray. He's bleak. He's glum. And you can read all kinds of great philosophical ponderings into his work, but I find it boring as all get all. I didn't find West boring, however. For one thing, it's a very short book, and he writes splendidly, I think. He writes well about very banal things, because he's examining the outsiders. He's examining the fringe elements, people who want to break into Hollywood, make it big in Hollywood, who are probably destined never to do so. So they're doomed to failure. He writes very well about that. And there are longueurs, even in this 165-page novel. Lots of sort of tedious passages, I think, rather Kafkaesque. But again, it's short enough, and he writes well enough, and it's about a milieu that I am fascinated by in an era that I'm fascinated by, 1930s and 40s. And just to bring it to the grand conclusion, and sort of his thesis, the book ends in what I would term a sort of in a zombie apocalypse, where you have this big premiere going on at what is basically Grauman's Chinese Theater, I think. And all the stars are coming in limousines, and they're going down the red carpet to see some big premiere at Grauman's. And thousands of people are on the streets, right, on Hollywood Boulevard, to see stars, to catch glimpses of stars. And Todd gets caught up in this, and it gets really violent. It becomes a riot, and it's just a sea of humanity. And West does a great job of describing how terrifying that can be. You get caught up in that thing, you could die. This is not fun and games. This is not glamorous. This is the exact opposite. It's it's just petrifying. So he does a good job of describing that. And the main character, as it were, of the novel, the masses, the disappointed masses, they take center stage. And there's a great description that I will just read. It's about a page, but it's worth it, because this is not only the climax of the novel, but it is sort of his thesis. So here we go. And seen through the eyes of Todd, once again, he's talking about these these voyeuristic people who've come to see the stars, but then it turns into a riot. It was a mistake to think them harmless curiosity seekers. They were savage and bitter, especially the middle-aged and the old. and had been made so by boredom and disappointment. All their lives they had slaved at some kind of dull, heavy labor, behind desks and counters, in the fields and at tedious machines of all sorts, saving their pennies and dreaming of the leisure that would be theirs when they had enough. Finally, that day came. They could draw a weekly income of $10 or $15. Where else should they go but California, the land of sunshine and oranges? Once there, they discover that sunshine isn't enough. They get tired of oranges, even of avocado pears and passion fruit. Nothing happens. They don't know what to do with their time. They haven't the mental equipment for leisure, the money nor the physical equipment for pleasure. Did they slave so long just to go to an occasional Iowa picnic? What else is there? They watched the waves come in at Venice. There wasn't any ocean where most of them came from, but after you've seen one wave, you've seen them all. The same is true of the airplanes at Glendale. If only a plane would crash once in a while so that they could watch the passengers being consumed in a holocaust of flame, as the newspapers put it. But the planes never crash. Their boredom becomes more and more terrible. They realize that they've been tricked and burn with resentment. Every day of their lives, they read the newspapers and went to the movies. Both fed them on lynchings, murders, sex crimes, explosions, wrecks, love nests, fires, miracles, revolutions, wars. This daily diet made sophisticates of them. The sun is a joke. Oranges can't titillate their jaded palates. Nothing can ever be violent enough to make taut their slack minds and bodies. They have been cheated and betrayed. They have slaved and saved for nothing. And Todd gets swept up in the riot. He's almost trampled to death, crushed to death. Cop takes him aside, puts him in a car, taking him to the hospital. And the sirens are... And Todd finds himself replicating the sound of the sirens in the police car. He's screaming just like the sirens. He's been driven nuts. That's how the book ends.
Can you read us the very end there, how it ends?
Sure.
Last few lines.
Yeah. He was carried through the exit to the back street and lifted into a police car. The siren began to scream, and at first he thought he was making the noise himself. He felt his lips with his hands. They were clamped tight. He knew then it was the siren. For some reason, this made him laugh, and he began to imitate the siren as loud as he could. So he's on the verge of lunacy at this point. He's maybe one of the disappointed whose dreams will never be fulfilled. So that's a rundown of the book. I tried to be as neutral as possible in my assessment of it. I'm giving you guys the basic lay of the land, and take it from here.
You mentioned it as a California novel. It can also be considered an LA novel, and I would argue a Hollywood novel. It exists on all three levels there. State,
yeah, sure.
local, and yeah. City, state.
Absolutely.
City, state. You have local government, you've got state, city government, and you've got state government. He's got all three aspects in there. The Hollywood aspect, the larger LA aspect, the larger California aspect. And I think that what we have to talk about here, Kev, is when I talk about Raymond Chandler, James M. Cain, Charles Bukowski, John Fonte, and yourself, we talk about these people as LA novelists. But I think there's another genre out there called the Hollywood novel that is specifically written about Hollywood. You talk about Bud Schulberg's What Makes Sammy Run. This is obviously a Hollywood novel. You have something like The Last Tycoon by F. Scott Fitzgerald. So what is the difference between an LA novel and a Hollywood novel, or are they kind of the same after a while? Is there a distinction to be made there?
Yeah, sure. I mean, anyone who writes a Hollywood novel is writing an LA novel, because I would argue that LA is Hollywood. because it has all the same elements, and Hollywood bleeds over into LA, and LA bleeds into Hollywood. They're hard to distinguish at a certain point.
Although Chandler wasn't right. Chandler and Kane were not writing Hollywood novels. They were writing LA novels.
Little Sister is arguably a Hollywood novel, 1949. Okay. That's where Marlowe enters the Hollywood milieu, right? With Mavis Weld and all that stuff. I mean, he occupies a Hollywood place.
I see.
And he's dealing with Hollywood types, and that's why I think that's almost my favorite LA/Hollywood novel. But yeah, I think the reason that it's sometimes a bit hard to distinguish if you are writing about Hollywood between a Hollywood novel and an LA novel, because Hollywood is in LA. Okay.
Well, listen, Kevin, I think the thing to say is every Hollywood novel is an LA novel, but not every LA novel is a Hollywood novel.
That's correct. That's right.
Okay.
And but again, for the reasons I've already specified, if you write about Hollywood, you're basically writing about LA, because a Hollywood novel, it's about people they're on the hustle. They're trying to make it. They're selling themselves. They're playing roles, right? This is LA. I mean, the thing you learn growing up in LA is how to sell yourself, right? Through your face, your form, your shtick. This is what you learn. You learn how to self-advertise. And that's partly Hollywood, but Los Angeles grew up through self-advertisement. It was the boosterism of the late 19th and early 20th century was enormous. That's why you always have these cracks by Nathanael West. Well, the most they could look forward to was an Iowa picnic. Chandler talks about the Iowans too. Miss Nosy from Farewell My Lovely, right? He's looking over to see what's going on at the house next door. Whatever her name is, I forget. But there's lots of. You'll see this in like in the LA novels. There's like little cracks about the Midwesterners who've all come to LA because LA has been trying to sell itself to them, to sell their real estate and populate the city and whatnot. So, and Hollywood started basically in the early aughts in Los Angeles, and that's exactly when Los Angeles started to grow up. So they're hand in hand, and it's hard to distinguish one from the other. Because Los Angeles wasn't really a thing. It wasn't really even a spot on the map until Hollywood came. So it is hard to distinguish. But I would argue that anyone who writes a good Hollywood novel is writing a good LA novel,
okay,
by virtue of that kinship.
It is an interesting distinction, and there is a gray area many times between the Hollywood and LA novel genre.
Right. There has to be. And this is a Hollywood novel, okay, first and foremost.
Okay.
So you say LA too and California too, fine. But it's a Hollywood novel first and foremost. He's writing about Hollywood types. He's writing about the Hollywood scene. He's writing from the perspective of a screenwriter in Hollywood. Okay, he's writing a Hollywood novel, but his broader critique is, yes, of LA, the Southland, and maybe California at large.
By the way, I just want to make
the dream at large, as I've said, the American dream, basically.
It is true, and I want to make sure I give credit where it's due. I am not the one who thought of the Hollywood genre of a novel. I saw it yesterday. I was watching a commentary on Double Indemnity by a couple film historians, and he did mention in the context of that movie that there should be a genre called the Hollywood novel, separate from an LA novel. So I just wanted to give credit there.
Well, I don't, whoever this guy is, I don't think he's the first to think it or say it.
Okay.
And
I
you
had
know,
never really heard. I had never really heard of a Hollywood genre of novels. I had always heard of
oh
L.A.
sure,
novels. Okay, but
oh
but
sure,
but let
not
me ask you this, Kev. I'm sure there's dozens of Hollywood novels out there. Where does Day of the Locust rank among the Hollywood novels you know about? Is it right up there at the top, or?
it's up there. Again, I'm not enamored of it. I'm not as enamored of it as I think a lot of East Coast intellectuals are. Uh, I mean, they put it in the same category as Kafka. It's like, or Dostoevsky. There's
Or
even like a book out
Dostoevsky?
there that
Sure.
is like it's like Dostoevsky and Nathaniel West, something like that.
Dostoevsky meets Hollywood.
Yeah, okay, good, fine, yeah, fine, but it doesn't mean I have to love the novel. Okay, good. There's interesting ideas there. I don't love the novel. I just don't. We'll be reading a book next week, "What Makes Sammy Run," uh, which, without having even cracked it yet, I know I love it. I've loved it for many years. And that's the great Hollywood novel, Bud Schulberg's "What Makes Sammy Run." And Bud Schulberg was an insider. He originally from New York, but his father moved his family out to LA very young, and he became eventually the head of Paramount Studios from 1926 to 1932, B.P. Schulberg. So Bud, some of you may know him as the screenwriter of On the Waterfront, won an Academy Award for that, okay, among other novels. But this is his great novel, What Makes Sammy Run. And he grew up. I mean, he also wrote a biography, an autobiography called "Moving Pictures: The Story of a Hollywood Prince," something like that. He was a Hollywood prince. He grew right up. He grew up just a little ways away from where our father grew up, because Paramount Studios is just down the street from Orange Drive. So Bud Schulberg was he is in the jaws of the monster, because he describes it that way sometimes, as a monstrosity. Hollywood. I mean, who would know better than the son of B.P. Schulberg, head of Paramount Studios, and the transition from silence to sound, by the way, 26 to 32. All very interesting. This is the great Hollywood novel that we will be reading in a week. I say that unreservedly. I know I won't be disappointed. I read it enough to solidify this opinion. Nathanael West, it's okay. It's an East Coaster. It's a New York guy. He gets existential on us. There's a lot of interesting writing in it, but it in the final analysis, it's not my cup of tea. Okay, I tried to do the reverse this time. Like last time, I was coming down hard on Mr. Fonte, and then I say, but I really like the novel. So I decided to start out the other way, like, basically giving kudos to West and showing how brilliant he is in certain of his passages and his thought processes. I appreciate that. I'm glad the novel exists, but it's not a favorite. It's just too drab and dreary and bleak and gray, and nothing really happens all that much, except for at the end. Okay. So I'm not a big fan of West. I'm not with Harold Bloom, who puts it in his 100 top novels of all time. I'm not sure, but I read that. Maybe it's just American. I love Harold Bloom. I think he's a great man, but I disagree with him putting Mr. West in his top 100 of American authors, world literature. I don't know whichever it was. But he's an intellectual, and intellectuals are really hipped on Nathanael West, right? And particularly because he died the next year. That often happens. Someone dies after they write something that's pretty good, and then it attains this mythical quality. So yeah, it's okay. It's okay. Read it, folks. It's interesting. It's a good book to have about Hollywood, particularly in this era. But it's not a favorite of mine. I would put it right there with Mr. Fonte and Ask the Dust. It's good, solid, right? Not saying I could do better, but I don't love it like I do Chandler's works that treat Hollywood and Los Angeles, like I do Kane, and like I do Mr. Schulberg.
You know, I was thinking of the pseudonym Nathanael West that he adopted. And why did he choose that one? I don't know. Maybe, but I was thinking unconsciously he may have had Nathaniel Hawthorne in mind, who was writing morality tales on the East Coast. And now he's doing the same thing on the West Coast. So you have Nathaniel and
Leave
Nathaniel
it to me
West.
to come up with that deep linguistic analysis of the name. Sure, why not? He spells it with an E though, not with an I.
Ah, okay. Well, I think Nathaniel Hawthorne, doesn't he spell it the same way? I don't know.
Maybe I'll
But
check.
but
Let's see.
I'm a big reader of Hawthorne, and he's always doing these allegories on moral issues, and that's what I see happening in
Of
Day of the
course,
If
Hawthorne spells it with an I.
okay. Anyway, you got the name Nathaniel though.
Of course, no. Why not? He's going to change something a little bit to
And
throw us off the scent.
the reason I came up with that analogy is because I don't know if you know this, but Leonard Bernstein in Hollywood, you had another guy named Elmer Bernstein doing Hollywood film tracks, film
Of course.
soundtracks. And in Hollywood, they spoke of Leonard Bernstein as Bernstein East and Elmer Bernstein as Bernstein West. That's what they were called. So I thought you have a Nathaniel East and a Nathaniel West. Now, is it an accurate thing to call this a morality tale, Kev? Day of the Locust?
Yeah,
On the level of a Hawthorne like Scarlet Letter, or
yeah, yeah. He's trying to teach us something. He's trying to show us. That's why I termed it when I read this last section with the riot. I said this is basically the book's thesis. Yeah, it's almost an academic approach. He's showing us. He just piling up the evidence that this is a sad milieu. This is a sad state of affairs. This is what the American dream has come to, and look at what its ramifications can be. This mass media of movies can emanate in mass violence. I've read some other stuff that, as a Jew, he was particularly sensitive to the rise of fascism in Europe, i.e. Germany in particular. And so this is also sort of a take on that development. Maybe you'd seen newsreels of the Nuremberg rallies, right? All these Nazis out there, hundreds of thousands of them at the Nuremberg rally, and this is kind of spooky. It's kind of scary, right? Jew or not, and maybe that's what was going on there. I've seen things on the internet where they mention that.
I'm going to give you a few quotes here and see what you think, see if you agree or not.
All right.
According to the Chicago Tribune, this is the sleazy side of Hollywood, the would-be's, the never-was's, the hopefuls, and the pretenders, the shames, the deceits, and the lies which they live all are here. It packs a knockout punch. Chicago Tribune.
It doesn't pack a knockout punch because I'm not blown away by these depictions, and a novel that is sort of dull, except for the end.
I will say
they're right about what he's trying to depict. He's depicting the losers in Hollywood, and the great thing about Schulberg in his book, What Makes Sammy Run, which we'll be analyzing next week, is that he depicts the winners as losers. That's an interesting take.
Okay. The winners themselves are the losers. That's a fascinating one. Okay, let me give you another quote. Another quote here from Malcolm Cowley. Do you know who Malcolm Cowley is?
Oh yeah, he was a great critic who spent time in Paris, at least France, in the 1920s, knew all the great expatriate writers. Malcolm Cowley, sure.
Okay, here's his quote. The Day of the Locust ranks first among the many novels about Hollywood.
When did he write that?
It doesn't give a date for that quote. It's just on the back of the book.
Well, he probably wrote that after What Makes Sammy Run came out. So I disagree.
You disagree with that? Okay.
I disagree.
And is it top 3, top 5, top 10?
Oh, I don't know. Again, it's not my cup of tea. I like a crisper prose. He writes beautiful prose in passages, no question. It's not my nice. I like a crisper prose. You'll see that with Schulberg. It's crisp. It's sharp. It's clean and ventilated. I've used those terms before. It moves. It moves you from one paragraph to the next. Boom, boom, boom. And that's what I like in my prose. I like a very Chandlerian style with a lot of humor. There's humor in West, but it's very subtle. You know, you got to really have an ear for it. I think I do, having, again, grown up in Los Angeles and preoccupying myself with the city and its past. I think I get a lot of his humor, sure. But it reminds me also when people talk about, how Nathanael West is so funny. They also say that about Kafka. These are these intellectuals I've been around all my life with. Kafka, he's great. Great existential writer. Okay, fine. You read him. You give me a nice summary of Das Schloss and Der Prozess in 2 minutes, and I'll have done with Kafka. I've read both those novels, The Castle and The Trial. I just find them tedious. And he's supposed to be so funny. You don't get the humor in Kafka? No, I'm sorry, I don't. I don't get the humor in Kafka. And you can argue for it all you like, but come on. If there are any jokey or even ironically funny passages in Kafka, then they are very few and far between. Or maybe it's just the grand thesis, like, Gregor Samsa wakes up one day and he's a bug, in his bed, and take it from there. The whole thing's funny from there on out. I don't know. As you can see, Kafka, don't like Kafka. Okay, so
I'm sure that I'm sure you would prefer an author like Woody Allen, who has Kafka-esque elements, but it's actually interesting and funny.
And it's got pace. It moves along quickly. Yeah, I love Woody Allen. You know that.
Yeah, I do too.
Yeah,
I mean, he's like a digestible version of Kafka.
Yeah, and his great book, Apropos of Nothing, his autobiography, is a fantastic read. I usually don't order books. I have enough books that I reread, as we can see, and reread and reread. But I ordered that recently, a hardcover. Wasn't cheap. Apropos of Nothing. It's a great read. He writes as well as he makes films. Fantastic, funny, crisp writing.
So you can tell the critics, you take your Kafka, I'll take Woody Allen.
I'll take Woody Allen, and I'll take, again, Bud Schulberg and What Makes Sammy Run. So, Bud, you better come through next week. I've been really touting you. Don't disappoint me.
Hey, Kev, are we ever gonna read The Last Tycoon by F. Scott Fitzgerald?
No, because I don't like it. I'd be predisposed from the beginning not to like it. I've tried it a couple times. It doesn't do anything for me.
How does it compare to Day of the Locust as a Hollywood novel?
It's not a complete novel. It ends like after 100 pages. You can't say anything about it. I think that was the greatest mistake, that Edmund Wilson brought that out right after his death and said this could have been his greatest novel. Well, I'm sorry, he didn't finish it. You can't say anything about it because his conception wasn't, completed. It's just, there's nice writing some places. There's that Fitzgerald touch, although he seems to have gone in a more Hemingway direction, more plain spoken prose in The Last Tycoon. And I don't like it. It's just, I wouldn't want anyone, had I written 100 pages of something, then I die, and you say, hey, look at this. I know how many revisions I put my things through, for one thing. And, I wouldn't want that exposed to public viewing. So I resent what Edmund Wilson did it's inevitable, though. It's going to come out. You're going to make money, and people want to read it. I'm interested in Fitzgerald. I want to see everything he put pen to paper to, but it's not productive. It's not helpful. No, I don't like The Last Tycoon. Leave that out. What I do like of Fitzgerald's, which we mentioned in one of our podcasts, is I love his Pat Hobby stories. Those are great. Those are little stories, little vignettes he sent off to Esquire in the 30s about being about a washed-up screenwriter in Hollywood. Those are great, and he conceived them as a novel, and they are now out as in a volume of about 150, 160 pages, a short little Hollywood novel. I would argue that's up there with What Makes Sammy Run.
Okay, and speaking of, as long as we're on the Hollywood,
so people have their attention focused on the wrong thing about Fitzgerald. It's not The Last Tycoon; it's the Pat Hobby stories.
So you're saying the Pat Hobby stories collectively constitute a great Hollywood novel, so to speak?
Not the great, but great. Small G. Yeah. It's a great little effort. It's a great little Hollywood novel.
Okay.
Composite. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
now,
it is.
As long as we're on the Hollywood novel genre, have you ever read Play It As It Lays by Joan Didion?
No, I haven't. I haven't read most of the modern stuff, to tell you the truth. I'm still too busy trying to learn from the old masters. No, is that a Hollywood novel or an LA novel?
I think it was considered a Hollywood novel from what I read. I haven't read it, but I read about it.
Okay. Well, one novel that I do like about Los Angeles, it's not Hollywood, but a more modern novel, which I would be willing to read again. It's very short, and I think I would have some good things to say about it, is Bret Easton Ellis's Less Than Zero.
Okay.
I think maybe we should add that to our list after What Makes Sammy Run. We can add that to our list, because it's a short novel. It's his first novel. I remember liking it. It's very sordid. It's very dark, but that seems to be the way of Hollywood / LA novels, right? Yep. I think the one I wrote, LA Kid, is like the brightest, sunshiniest one you'll ever read, although I didn't intend it that way. But in comparison to all these that we've been reading, my goodness.
Well, Kev, you also wrote a Hollywood novel, so to speak, in your Errol Flynn, An Epic Life, which you did as a poem, epic poem in the Byronic stanza. And you were writing about that same era of time in Hollywood in poetic form that Nathanael West. And anything to say about your version of the Hollywood novel compared to the rest of these? Did you have the same experience of exploring the seamy dark side of Hollywood, or were you mostly going with the fantastic flashy side of Hollywood when you wrote your
both, because I was telling the life of Errol Flynn, An Epic Life, and an epic connotes great highs and great lows, and that was Flynn's life. And he did have there were some very, I won't say sleazy, but very questionable aspects to Mr. Flynn's life, and as well as some great high points and some glorious triumphs. So that's Hollywood, I suppose. So that, if you want to call the novel, it's not really. It's a biography in verse form. It's a reimagined biography. I stick close to the facts, but I do go off on sort of little imaginative arcs here and there, imagining conversations and whatnot. But no, that's my best claim to a Hollywood novel. And I dove into that and spent 12 years from the moment I started it to when it finally got published. And that's the work I'm most proud of. And that will, if I'm at all remembered, which I doubt, that will be the one which people might associate with my name after my demise.
It might not be a novel, but it certainly is the most novel among your works.
That's true. And it will remain so no matter what I do from here on out.
No matter what anybody does, that would be right up there among the novelties that are quite fascinating and well done.
So give it a look, folks. Available on Amazon and fine bookstores near you.
Kev, back to Day of the Locust, because we've only got about 7 minutes left here. What do you think? What do you think of this title, The Day of the Locust?
Well, I was as baffled by it as you, and I knew you'd ask that question because you always do about the titles, which is completely, legitimate. It's the title, for goodness sake. Well, the first thing I thought, I've always thought the Day of the Locust, I always imagine a plague of locusts, and where they destroy. And it's pretty clear that this riot at the end, and his whole thesis of how these disappointed people, they're feeding off Hollywood, they're feeding off these images, this mass entertainment that has only been invented a couple of decades earlier. They're feeding on it like locusts, and they eventually will become a destructive force. That's how I imagined it. Almost kind of biblical, like the visitation of Locust on Egypt in Exodus in the Bible, because Pharaoh will not let my people go. Right. Those are the connotations I had with that title, but I don't know what he was thinking himself. But that's what I've always thought, something like that. I don't know what you.
Well, you said you thought I was baffled by the title. It's never really addressed in the book. It's only a symbolic title,
right?
Kind of like "Ask the Dust." It's like
Yes.
It's not really mentioned in the context of the novel, so you just got to kind of figure it out for yourself and make your own.
Farewell, my lovely.
Yeah, farewell.
All three very cool titles, I would argue, right? And that's maybe the mark of a cool title. It doesn't directly address what might be going on in the book, although Day of the Locust is the closest, I think, if you believe my rating.
It's interesting because these authors who give these ambiguous symbolic titles, they kind of leave the reader, as you say, baffled. And what could it mean? And they have it in the back of their mind the whole time they're reading the book. But it forces you to make your own associations, and it forces you as a reader to enter that world and kind of draw your own conclusions. And I like the conclusion you drew. Day of the Locust is a swarm of destructive entities who are going to strip the place bare and leave a path of destruction. That kind of speaks to the last chapter of the novel. And I would also submit that last chapter is foreshadowed by the first chapter, which is a battle of Waterloo being reproduced on the backlot. And you see all this war and chaos. So that's a nice little foreshadowing of what's going to happen at the end of the novel, I believe.
Right. Well, it's an excellent title insofar as it does conjure this image, which would seem to be very apt for the thematic content of the novel itself. So, successful title, I would say then.
Good title. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, we've only got about 5 minutes left. Is there any? First of all, let me ask you this question. You've been talking up Bud Stolberg's book, and I'm sure I'll find it somewhere.
He better come true. I mean, I'm reading. I'm going to crack it as soon as we get off here. I'm going to start reading it. He better come through, Bud.
Okay.
Don't fail me now.
Well, so I'm assuming you don't want to read Miss Lonely Hearts by Nathanael West before we move on to something else.
No, look, I like Nathanael West. I like his biography. He was a writer who was in there punching, trying to make a living as a screenwriter. He wrote some good stuff. Miss Lonely Hearts. It doesn't linger in mind. It didn't leave some great afterglow with me. I'm not a big Nathanael West fan, but I appreciate the guy. And I'm glad the Day of the Locust is there. It's good that we have this novel. And thank you, Nathanael. I appreciate that. You justified your existence through this novel. I'm not putting in my top 100 novels, though, like Mr. Bloom. That's all.
Well, you do. I did see on the Wikipedia entry that the critics tend to put Miss Lonely Hearts even above Day of the Locust, at least.
Yeah.
But you don't want to read that. You don't want to read it.
No, I'm not. Again, I'm not a big West fan.
Okay.
I'm not a big Fante fan. I want to give them their due, particularly because they wrote these Los Angeles / Hollywood novels that has placed them in the pantheon.
Sure.
So yeah, I'm always open. I mean, I'm like the most open guy you can imagine. You give me Kafka to read, that's like the only guy I won't read again.
I'll be sure to avoid.
We should title this the anti-Kafka rant.
Maybe I'll put that as a subtitle, huh?
I dislike him even more than Dostoevsky. That's another cool guy that you're not supposed to dislike. But, you know, what can I say?
Dostoevsky apparently was a big influence on Nathanael West, from what I read.
It makes sense. Yeah, Kafka, Dostoevsky, Nathanael West, all the East Coast intellectuals love these guys. So, yeah. But I'm a West Coast guy. I like Jack London. Okay, I like Charles Bukowski. I like Raymond Chandler. So take that.
All right. We'll take that. And we're pretty much near the end. Any final thoughts before I sign off here?
No.
Okay. We've said all that needs to be said about Day of the Locust by Nathanael West. Next week, we will be exploring What Makes Sammy Run by Bud Schulberg. Thank you, Kevin McAleer, and we'll see you next week.
Adios.